Hello, and welcome to United for Peace, Episode 3.4, The Indonesian National Revolution, Part 4. Welcome back for our conclusion of the Indonesian National Revolution. Before we begin today, I humbly request feedback of any sort on whatever platform you happen to use for this show, or whatever is most convenient. It's up to you. Either way, I am getting a little nervous with so many downloads, but no feedback whatsoever. What you think I do well, what you think I could improve upon, how the sound quality is, anything you got, I want to know it. And now, back to the show. We ended last time with the United Nations becoming directly involved in the conflict between Republican Indonesia and the Netherlands. A ceasefire being the note we left off on. The UN would continue efforts to mediate peace between the Republic of Indonesia and the Netherlands, with obvious sympathy towards the Republic. While the UN allowed the Republic's representative, Syahrir, to speak on behalf of the Republic, it refused to admit representatives from the Dutch-occupied Indonesian territories. What's more, in October 1947, American, Australian, and Belgian representatives formed a Good Offices Committee under the auspices of the United Nations and assisted Dutch-Indonesian negotiations towards new ceasefire terms. Since the Dutch had clear military superiority at this time, international pressure for a new ceasefire agreement was politically advantageous for the Republic. A deal was reached by January 1948, signed aboard the USS Renville on the 17th, and hence creatively referred to as the Renville Agreement. This instituted a ceasefire along a line connecting the most advanced positions of the Dutch forces, despite several Republican-held areas remaining behind said lines. Although the Republicans were incentivized partially by their shortage of ammunition, their willingness to reach this compromise earned them the respect of U.S. American statespeople, which translated into international political capital. Despite the practical reasons for the Republic to enter the Renville Agreement, such an enormous concession to the Dutch, following such a humiliatingly swift defeat by them, was too much embarrassment for the people to deal with, and capital L, capital W, left-wing Prime Minister Syarifudin's government fell apart. Masyumi, that is, the Islamic, and the Nationalist Party members of his cabinet resigned following the Renville Agreement, and he himself resigned as Prime Minister on January 23, 1948. He expected another leftist cabinet to form when he left, but Sukarno had other ideas. He created an emergency presidential cabinet which would last into 1949. This cabinet was led by Hatta and reported directly to him rather than the National Committee. It was mostly centrist in orientation, drawn largely from the nationalist, Masyumi, and nonpartisan individuals. Syarifudin and the left wing, again capital L, capital W, formed a new government opposition, the Democratic People's Front, though his old companion Syahrir formed a new socialist party in 1948, which peeled off many supporters from the left wing and which supported the new cabinet. Meanwhile, the Dutch continued pursuing their federal Indonesia plan, though without great success. They succeeded in creating several federal states out of the territory they conquered, totaling 15 by November 1948. They were organized under a provisional government, which Lieutenant Governor Van Mook unveiled in March 1948, of which he was president. Not exactly the best move if you want your puppet government to be convincingly Indonesian, but then again, the whole project might just fall apart if you let an Indonesian lead the thing, and wouldn't that just be a disaster? In July, they set up an assembly for federal consultation made up of the leaders of the several federal states. With or without the Republic of Indonesia's agreement, Van Mook and his supporters intended to create a United States of Indonesia by the end of 1948. This would almost certainly entail a strong military action, however, as the teeming masses offered little support for federalism, and the social elites still largely supported the Republic. Van Mook and the Dutch had some reason for optimism, however, as the Republic certainly found itself in a desperate, chaotic situation. However, I would call it a mixed bag rather than a disaster, although it will certainly look disastrous until we get through most of this year. First, a Dutch blockade, insufficient agricultural land in the Javanese interior, and an influx of up to 6 million refugees and soldiers into said land caused acute food scarcity and general hardship. In addition to the blockade, the Republican government printed more money to cover its costs, leading to spiking inflation and significantly higher rice prices. However, even this was not totally bad. Due to the rise in rice prices, peasants' incomes rose as well, wiping out many of their debts. Consequently, there was something of a socio-economic leveling between the rural and urban population, reducing the overall appetite for revolutionary social change. In short, sometimes, when you lose, you win. However, things were rather more disastrous in North Sumatra, Tapanuli to be exact, where a mini-civil war erupted as retreating Republican units led by squabbling officers congested the region. On top of this, a nationwide civil war seemed possible again by the end of 1948. The units retreating into the Javanese interior included the famed Siliwangi Division. The division was largely comprised of Sundanese people loyal to Hatta's cabinet, which wanted to reduce the size of the army. The Siliwangi Division's commander agreed with this plan, favoring a smaller but more professional army, thinking that the enhanced professionalism would make it overall more effective as a fighting force and reduce a lot of the logistical strains currently facing the Indonesian army. But, spoiler, this issue is not going anywhere anytime soon, even though we will see a little bit of progress made on it. These qualities put them at odds with local Javanese units comprised of course, Javanese individuals, who are themselves radical irregulars mostly, who backed Supreme Commander Sudirman, who opposed reducing the army's size. That is part of what made these irregulars back him. And beyond the fact their own jobs as soldiers would be eliminated, at a political level, they did not want to see so many units loyal to the government opposition disbanded, as the plan would call for. And so, the army split itself into factions over this idea, and it was not long before kidnappings, murders, and brawls started taking place in the Yogyakarta-Surakarta area. These cities are, recall, respectively, the current seats of the government and the government opposition. As if this was not enough trouble, another prominent communist suddenly returned from the Soviet Union. Enter Munawar Musso. Musso trained as a teacher, though he was still pretty young when he got mixed up in radical politics. As a member of the Communist Party, he was arrested for his involvement in a farmers' revolt. He was, quote, handled roughly, end quote, aka tortured, as the police attempted to draw confessions from him about the revolt's organization and leadership. Reportedly, however, he refused to confess, and from then on he harbored a significant grudge against the Dutch government, as one would. By late 1925, he and other Communist Party leaders planned rebellion against the Dutch East Indies government, though the government was well aware and managed to arrest most of these leaders. They did not capture Musso, however, who escaped to Singapore, where he continued to plot. In one case, he sent an agent of his to Manila to get support from fellow communist in exile Tan Malaka, though Malaka rejected the plan. Malaka also tried to prevent them carrying through with part of the plan, going to Moscow to ask for material assistance for a revolt from the Comintern. He simply arrived in Singapore too late to prevent their departure in January 1926. The Comintern rejected Musso's plan as well, thinking it premature, and sent him to learn in Soviet state schools. Besides a secret visit in 1935 for the purpose of establishing an underground Communist Party organization, he had been gone from Indonesia since 1926. But in August 1948, 22 years later, he landed back in Indonesia by plane. 3 days later, a newspaper announced his return, and Sukarno quickly invited him to his presidential palace in Yogyakarta. Musso was a more senior politician than he, and they had actually been close friends as they attended school together in Surabaya, even sharing a boarding house. They were not to remain united long, however, as Musso set about his heavily Soviet-influenced agenda. With Tan Malaka remaining imprisoned and the secret organization of Musso's ticking along, most East and Central Java leaders of the People's Democratic Front and the Communist Party immediately accepted Musso's authority, and Syarifudin himself announced he had been a member of that underground organization since 1935. I don't know if that is really true. It could just be an attempt to bolster his reputation, but it was accepted as a matter of fact. Now, I say most PDF leaders because some were inclined towards Syahrir's socialism, and many remain loyal to Tan Malaka, whose vision of Indonesian national communism, as previously mentioned, departed from Soviet ideology remarkably. Musso, however, maintained the idea that there could only be one party for the working class, and he denounced the Indonesian national revolution as a bourgeois affair. By September 1948, the major leftist parties of the People's Democratic Front had dissolved themselves and merged with the Communist Party to follow him. The party formed a new Politburo on September 1st, which included many individuals who would continue being prominent Communist Party leaders even into the 60s. Musso's push for worker strikes, peasant demonstrations, seizure of landlords' land, pro-Soviet pronouncements, and more presented such a serious problem for the Republican government that they went so far as to release Tan Malaka, hoping he could peel off enough support from Musso to undercut his plans, putting faith into the power of good old leftist infighting. Beyond the social unrest, all of this threatened their diplomatic strategy of winning the sympathy of the USA, which was going well so far. And, if nothing else, Malaka at least professed an idea of socialism less like Stalin's and apparently more suitable for Indonesia. Unfortunately for the government, Malaka did not peel off enough support to prevent a major showdown with Musso's communist forces. The communist problem came to a head in mid-September when open warfare broke out between pro-communist and pro-government army units in Yogyakarta, along with armed private citizens. The Siliwangi Division, however, quickly drove the Communist Party forces out of the city itself. The communists regrouped at Madiun, where they were joined by other pro-communist forces who left their positions along the Van Mook line to help defend that city. Communist Party supporters, announced from Madiun on September 18th that they were forming a new National Front government. Effectively, they were now going all in on a coup d'etat or a protracted civil war, hoping to usurp the state. Radical Army Commander Sudirman wanted to negotiate an end to this fighting that would involve only the arrest of the leaders of the nascent coup attempt. Although he did not like the current Republican government and sympathized with opposition to the demobilization plans, he wished to avoid a civil war. Sukarno, Hatta, and the Siliwangi Division's leadership demanded a more drastic solution, however. On the 19th, around 200 communist and other leftist leaders were arrested in Yogyakarta, and Sukarno broadcast an appeal to Indonesians to back him and Hatta rather than Musso and his vision of a Soviet-style government. Musso answered with his own broadcast, expecting that the peasants and industrial workers of Indonesia were extremely fed up with the bourgeois politicians and the moderate character of the national revolution, that they were all in favor of his Communist Party's radical agenda. And so he announced he would fight to the finish. Once again, however, Sukarno was a well-respected individual, and even military units sympathetic to the government opposition decided to stay out of the fight altogether. Remaining PDF organizations in Banten and Sumatra, those who hadn't joined the Communist Party, publicly distanced themselves from Madiun, justly pointing out they had opted not to join the Communist Party on account of Musso's extreme beliefs. Pro-government forces, with the Siliwangi Division acting as vanguard, assaulted Madiun, where 5,000 to 10,000 pro-communist troops were. As the rebels lost ground, they began killing known figures in the Islamic and nationalist parties. This sparked enormous outbreaks of violence between nominal and strict Muslims in the villages around the city, as strict Muslims sought revenge upon the largely pro-communist nominal Muslims for the wanton murder of their respected leaders. Although the rebels abandoned Madiun on September 30th, it would take a long time for pro-government forces to track down and eliminate all rebel forces after this. Amir Syarifuddin and 300 rebel troops were captured on December 1st, after which Amir and several other Communist Party leaders were shot. Whether he was a sincere believer in Musso's Marxism-Leninism, or just a disgraced politician trying to win back some power, his move to support Musso took him, previously one of the most powerful and prestigious politicians in the Indonesian Republic, and left him lifeless at the bottom of a wall. Musso, on the other hand, had been captured much earlier. He was killed on October 31st, reportedly while attempting to escape captivity. Now, reporting someone as killed in an escape attempt is extremely frequently used as a euphemism for extrajudicial execution in revolutionary and authoritarian regimes. I couldn't find any sources detailing Musso's apparent escape attempt, though admittedly I didn't look very long. And there may have been a source with more details, but it is in Indonesian, which I cannot read. So, I hope I'm not making an ass of myself by suggesting this was possibly extrajudicial execution, because I'm almost certain it was actually. No one really knows how many people died in the Battle of Madiun and the following sectarian violence around the city, but the consensus is at least 8,000. Madiun was a tragedy, though it ironically came with some upsides for the Republican government. This seems to be a trend with this revolution. The government faces a crisis, escalating tensions and possibly civil war, but then it comes out of it stronger than it went in. Tension between strict and nominal Muslims intensified, with much violence having already flared up between them, and strict Muslims increasingly questioning whether the Republic is capable of truly protecting them. Thousands lay dead, and tens of thousands in captivity. However, the Communist Party threat to the Republican establishment was eliminated until the 50s, and the left in general was discredited. Professionally oriented officers and the Sukarno-Hatta government's alliance was cemented, the officer corps purged of unstable radical elements, and lots of irregular troops were disbanded. Tan Malaka even formed a new, more moderate left-wing party, the Proletarian Party, out of elements of the left which had opposed Musso and the Madiyun Rebellion. What's more, since the Republic defeated a communist uprising, vague US-American sympathy turned into diplomatic support based on the nation's global political strategy. Many communist rebellions were underway throughout Southeast Asia. Mao Zedong's forces were pressing towards victory in China, and the Soviets were now blockading West Berlin. So the USA was pretty concerned by the rapid political advances of communism. And so, when the Netherlands made a final attempt to reconquer Indonesia, the USA vehemently opposed it. After all, why threaten a regime that's proven itself perfectly capable of keeping communism down? And here we are now, at that final attempt to reconquer Indonesia. The Dutch, failing to get the Republic to budge on cooperation with their unilateral federalization policies, launched their second, quote-unquote, police action on December 18th, 1948. Although they quickly captured all major cities left under Republican control at that time and captured the civilian government, this operation would prove disastrous for them. First, the civilian government intended to allow the Dutch to capture them. They figured that international opinion would turn so sharply against the Netherlands that this would actually help the Republic. Second, the aforementioned UN Good Offices Commission was just outside Yogyakarta when the Dutch launched their assault on the city. The insult to the UN's dignity, authority, and good intentions prompted outrage in the UN Security Council. Furthermore, the USA cut off all delivery of financial aid to the Netherlands intended for expenses in Indonesia. Many in the US Congress pushed for all financial aid to the Dutch to be cut off. Again, as US assistance was the cornerstone of post-World War II recovery for the Netherlands, such a cut would be nothing less than calamitous. The woes mounted for the Dutch on more fronts still. Republican forces launched full-scale guerrilla warfare all across Java and Sumatra, and many Dutch positions operated virtually under siege. Indonesian civilians by and large refused to cooperate at all with the Dutch forces. Even aristocrats and monarchs, whose thirst for wealth and power previously led them to work with the Netherlands, refused to even discuss how they could work within the Dutch system at this point. Even further still, the cabinets of two states created under the Dutch federal plan, East Indonesia and Pasundan, resigned in protest over the operation. They may have been willing to work with the Netherlands, but only on the condition that it regarded Indonesia generally as an equal partner. Nasution, the Siliwangi Division commander and now deputy commander of the entire Republican Army, declared a military government on December 22, 1949. On December 22, 1948, though most units operated autonomously during this period anyway. On December 31st, 1948, the Dutch, facing a brutal guerrilla war, international pressure, and a faltering Indonesian political plan, accepted UN calls for a ceasefire in Java. They accepted the same for Sumatra on January 5th, 1949. But guerrilla fighting continued nonetheless. Forces led by Lieutenant Colonel Suharto, a future president of Indonesia, captured and held Yogyakarta for 6 hours on March 1st, 1949, humiliating the Dutch forces. The game was effectively over for the Dutch at that point anyway, however. In late January, the USA publicly denounced the Netherlands and threatened to terminate all financial aid if they did not give up on this conquest. Concurrently, on January 28, 1949, the UN Security Council passed Security Council Resolution 67, which demanded the release of the Republican cabinet, establishment of an interim government, and full transfer of sovereignty by July 1st. Unless you are new to this show and the UN in general, you should know that UN Security Council resolutions are legally binding. The Netherlands now faced the prospect of direct international intervention if they did not meet these demands. And so, the Dutch bitterly accepted them by April 1949. The Republican government got back to Yogyakarta on July 6, 1949, Dutch troops having already pulled out of the city. Many army commanders hesitated to accept the return of rule by these civilians who had allowed themselves to be captured, but they acquiesced when Sukarno threatened to resign if they did not. Once again, Sukarno held things together with his immense gravitas. Were this a different kind of show, I might say something more vulgar. Following this return, conferences were held in Yogyakarta and Jakarta, at which representatives of the federal states and the Republic of Indonesia agreed to form a new Republic of the United States of Indonesia, with the Republican Army at the core of their new armed forces. Sukarno and Hatta would be named president and vice president of the new country. Over the next couple months, small clashes would roll on even past ceasefire declarations in Java and Sumatra, though most fighting stopped. That is, not counting the Darul Islam movement, when strict Muslims attempted to create an Islamic state. The rebellion started in West Java in August 1949, quickly linked up with the Muslim controllers of Aceh, which we have previously mentioned, and eventually linked up as well with rebels in South Sulawesi. More on that at a later date. For now, we are going to set that rebellion aside, because we don't need to worry about the specifics of combat in it really, just the political implications of it happening going forward. But perhaps not everything was lost for the Netherlands, even at this late hour. A roundtable conference at The Hague from August 23rd to November 2nd, 1949, resulted in an agreement upon a loose union between the Netherlands and the Republic of the United States of Indonesia. It cast the Dutch monarch as a symbolic head of state, Sukarno as president of Indonesia, and Hatta as vice president and prime minister. It also included a couple concessions particularly insulting to the Indonesians. First, the Netherlands would maintain sovereignty over West Irian, otherwise known as West Papua or Western New Guinea. Second, Indonesia accepted responsibility for the debt of the Dutch East Indies, fixed at 4.3 billion francs. And because colonizers can't ever seem to leave subjugated lands with honor, this debt included a lot of expenses involved in the attempt to crush the Indonesian national revolution. So, newly independent Indonesia would have to pay the cost of war waged against it. Nonetheless, the Netherlands formally transferred sovereignty to Indonesia, excluding West Irian. The Republic of the United States of Indonesia, to which sovereignty was passed, only lasted until August of 1950 though, and even then, only nominally for most of that time. In late January 1950, Captain Westerling planned to assassinate several ministers of the Indonesian cabinet, having commanded his troops to infiltrate Jakarta to do just that. This followed an aborted attempt to take control of Bandung by seizing key points with 800 troops. He was persuaded to leave the city by the Dutch High Commissioner and commander of the local Dutch garrison. Once this plot was uncovered, most of the federal states of Indonesia chose to dissolve themselves before the end of March 1950. West Kalimantan was forcibly taken over directly by the Indonesian government in April, after its sultan was arrested in connection to Westerling's plot. Yet again, royals and aristocrats siding with colonizers to retain wealth and status, despite their refusal to do so just a little bit ago in this story. Also in April, colonial troops in East Indonesia, mostly Ambonese Christians, who were concerned with the dominance of Javanese Muslims in the Republic, clashed with Republican units. The state's government having been compromised by this, a new East Indonesian cabinet formed in May and intended to dissolve the state into a unitary Indonesia. Since nothing can ever go so smoothly in a revolution, however, this state's former Minister of Justice proclaimed a Republic of South Maluku in Ambon, resulting in a conflict between this breakaway state and Republican forces from July to November, ending in Republican victory. East Sumatra, the last real holdout, followed its sibling states and went along with unitarism. Setting aside the Ambon Rebellion and Darul Islam, Indonesia finally unified on August 17, 1950, the 5th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. A unitary, though provisional, constitution was enacted, all which was formerly the Republic of the United States of Indonesia became simply the Republic of Indonesia. Jakarta was named this new state's capital. With the Indonesian National Revolution finally concluded, we will leave the story here for now. Thank you for listening. Once again, I humbly implore you to leave this show a review on whatever platform you listen to, or whatever is most convenient. You can also send any questions, comments, and or concerns to my business email, ufppodcast@gmail.com. Again, that is UFP, as in United for Peace, podcast@gmail.com. Join me next time on United for Peace, as we briefly summarize Indonesian history between 1950 and 1961, when UN forces deploy in West Irian, because, as it turns out, the end of the revolution does not mean the end of conflict between the Netherlands and the Republic of Indonesia.